Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Tony Showala. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the operations lead for RSA US. I'm joined today by two of my amazing colleagues at RSA US, Claire Byrne and Alexa Clay. And on behalf of all of us, we would like to thank you for joining us in today's conversation. What's the role of policy in strengthening connection? Before we get started with the conversation, we just want to tell you a little bit about the RSA, RSA US, and cover some practices that we're always aspiring to when we hold spaces for folks. Founded in the UK, we are the Royal Society for Arts, Manufacturers, and Commerce, and have been uniting people and ideas to resolve the challenges of our time since 1754. Today, we are over 31,000 fellows strong with nearly 1,200 fellows here in the US. We're committed to a world that is resilient, rebalanced, and regenerative, where everyone can fulfill their potential. Now, I mentioned some best practices and some ways of being that we're always aspiring to when we get together. Those are listed here on the slide. As I mentioned, this session is being recorded, so if you want to do any renaming of yourself in that light, you're welcome to. But these are some of the things we're always aspiring to do and be as we show up with one another. And that is using language that celebrates folks' humanity, speaking for yourself, sharing pronouns, being aware of the language that you're using and the impact of that language, as well as the history that goes along with it and the impact it may have on others. Which is one of the other things that we're always trying to be aware of is the impact that we may have on other folks. Creating space for all voices. So if speaking up is something that may be a little outside of your comfort zone, we would encourage you that this is a safe space. We want to hold it for you and create an opportunity for you to be able to share things. And also, if you're someone who tends to speak up a lot, maybe taking a breath, taking a break before doing so again and letting other folks chime in. As I mentioned, we're working on and trying to cultivate and create a safe space for everybody. So encouraging you all to show up in ways that are authentic to you, whether that be on camera, off camera, engaging with the chat, listening, whatever works best for you and is safe for you, depending on where you might be and what you might be doing, like in transit or those kinds of things. With all that being said, if you do have any questions, if there's anything that we can do to help, please feel free to message either my colleague Claire or myself. We're here to provide any support that you all might need. As I am talking about just the last few logistics, I'm just going to transition to a slide that shows our speakers today to get you all a bit acclimated with them. If needs be, like I said, you can reach out to either Claire or myself via the chat. There are likely going to be a lot of resources that are shared during this event. We will be collecting and collating all of those and sending those to anyone who registered via Eventbrite for this event. There is a recording, and we will also make that available to you in that post-event email. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Alexa Clay, who is the director of RSA US, to get us started.
Wonderful. Thanks, Tony. I'm excited to introduce our first speaker today, Sam Pressler. Sam is a community builder, researcher, and writer focused on connecting people to the communities, connections, and commitments that make life worth living. He is a practitioner fellow at UVA's Karsh Institute of Democracy, a research affiliate at the Harvard Human Flourishing Program, and the author of Connective Tissue, a policy framework on the role of government in regenerating connection within communities that we'll be discussing today. In his past life, Sam was the founder and executive director of the Armed Services Arts Partnership, the nation's largest community arts organization serving veterans and their families. This is our second public event with Sam, so really excited to have you back. Last time we dipped our toe into some powerful conversations exploring the role of culture change in shaping policy and also topics around who gets to create policy change. We're really excited to hear both from Sam and Fred today, but also from you in terms of your own experience in creating social connections and engaging in policy or practice change in your communities. So Sam, I'm going to hand over to you for a brief introduction, and then we'll weave Fred in.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that intro. Can you guys see my screen now? Cool. I'm going to begin with just a quick presentation. I don't want this to be talking at y'all in any way, but I found last time we did this, it was just good grounding for the conversation. So yeah, as Alexa mentioned, name's Sam Pressler. I'm the author of this Connective Tissue policy framework, which is really oriented around a very big question, which is what's the role of policy in strengthening connection in American communities? Bigger question than I even imagined when I started the project. And I'm excited to now be in the phase where I'm getting to share it with y'all. So before we jump in, I really want to kind of start with my background and what led me to this work. I know a lot of people in this RSA group are kind of community builders themselves, and that's very much how I come to this work. As Alexa mentioned, started the Armed Services Arts Partnership, or ASAP, this community arts organization for veterans and military families. And that was really my formative experience in just the not just the like surface level around kind of connection is good, but like the almost magical, unspeakable power of getting people together around a shared purpose or a shared mission from all these different backgrounds and seeing what can happen over the course of a few weeks, a few months, in terms of people going from strangers to kind of neighbors who are willing to support one another unconditionally. And so many of those stories kind of created this what I couldn't describe as anything other than a sacred experience of community. And so when I handed that organization off to a new executive director, I was like asking myself these questions like, what just happened here? I'm a civilian, I'm not an artist. How did I become the head of this like largest veteran military arts organization in the country? And what was that kind of magical thing that was happening underneath the thing? And I was very fortunate to do a fellowship at Harvard, and through some research and writing I was doing in that work, I kind of had this aha moment where I was like, oh, this is really about how do we connect or how do we reconnect people to the kind of communities, the relationships, the commitments that make our lives worth living, that give our lives meaning. Um, it was really through that work, through that set of questions, that I ended up in a lot of conversations early last year with policymakers who were starting to have this recognition that, there was a problem underneath so many of the problems in American life, whether it be kind of premature mortality and deaths of despair, whether it be economic immobility, whether it be democratic backsliding, that there was a deeper root cause, which was the weakening of our civic and social lives. And in the US, we saw a lot of policymakers who were starting to show kind of a motivation to take action. You saw the Surgeon General, who's pictured here. You saw Senator Murphy from Connecticut, who were kind of putting forth policy solutions to this issue. The challenge that I observed, like kind of being in these conversations over the course of the last year, was that connection and social capital, these words can be very squishy. And in addition, this space of policymaking was very underdeveloped. And so despite this motivation and this energy, there was not really a clear sense of where you could begin, like where you can kind of hook into this work. And that's essentially why we created this policy framework. It was just to provide an actionable, organized starting point for a connection-focused policymaking agenda. And really the hope was not to provide an answer, but really introduce a entry point or a beginning that people can build on. And so what I'll talk about here very briefly is just how we structured it and then how do we hope to make it actionable. The first thing was like taking this really broad, really a big question and trying to break it into its component parts to make it accessible. And so we structured it into 4 chapters that seem to represent kind of comprehensively where different things can fit in. One on foundational changes, one on community institutions, one on life transitions, and one on enabling conditions. And then each of those chapters included 3 to 4 related sections. Once we had that architecture in place, we wanted to kind of actually go deeper than just the structure and figure out how we can make this actionable for policymakers and practitioners. And what we did there was organize each section that I talked about by the level of government and philanthropy that could take action. And then within that, identify specific policy opportunities that those stakeholders could act on. And then even further, pretty much in every page of the framework, provide an example or a case study or a resource that brings that policy opportunity to life. And so the framework ends up looking like this really broad, covering everything from foundational changes, like measures that need to be in place, personnel, connection lens, to community institutions, which are these things that are occurring within communities that, can affect connection within communities, to life transitions, which are these kind of points of possibility and peril when we go through change in life that where policy could potentially play a role, all the way to enabling conditions, which are these things that like work or like tech and media that are happening outside of community, but very much influence our lives within communities. And so today I'm not going to go into the framework in depth. Given that there are kind of practitioners and community builders on the call, what I wanted to do is actually show how community builders featured in the framework leverage their experiences and their work to shape policy, and to say that the policy isn't something that just happens to us. It's something that we could be active shapers of through our experiences. And so I'll just start with my own experience with ASAP. When we were getting started, we were really on the cutting edge of doing community-based arts programming with veterans, and groups like the National Endowment for the Arts, the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Department of Defense. We're trying to figure out how to leverage the arts for the military. And so what we ended up doing was having a seat at the table, not only to shape the design of kind of the community arts funding and programming through the federal government, but also to kind of be able to provide access to those funding opportunities, which organizations like our own and also a lot of other community arts organizations have now been able to get access to. The second group I want to showcase is the American Exchange Project, who I feature in the policy framework. They're a group that takes juniors and seniors in high school from very different parts of the country, so like Palo Alto, California, and Texas, and they have them do kind of a domestic exchange program where they each spend intensive time together in these different places, building relationships across these lines of class, geographic, demographic difference that ultimately are building this kind of cross-class connection in the adult transition. And David, who is their CEO, he's now working with many state governments to be able to write draft legislation that will fund these exchange programs through the education budget, through the service budgets of those states, and so that they don't need to just be relying on philanthropy to fund that work. The final group I want to talk about is Welcoming America, which I actually did an event with earlier this week, who I also feature in the framework. And they're really focused on helping places become more welcoming to immigrants and refugees. And they don't do this through directly doing policy change, but by actually shaping the conditions of policy in cities. And so they have a certification framework, which basically has a set of standards that cities must meet to become welcoming certified. And by creating this certification standard that's well regarded and that's reputable, they actually shape the policies and practices and actions of local government to make their communities more welcoming and connected for newcomers, particularly immigrants and refugees. And so I think what I want to close with here is just to say that this is something that policymakers are really hungry for. They are thinking about these issues of how do we regenerate connection within communities, but actually people who are doing the community building work themselves, you have this unique situatedness to shape that local policy. You're doing the work, you have the proximity to these communities. And so my kind of hope, call, and kind of provocation is that there's an opportunity to not just be on the sidelines, but actually be kind of agents in shaping policy to strengthen connection in communities. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and excited to bring Alexa and Fred back into the conversation.
Thanks so much, Sam. It's always great to hear your rendition of this. I just really appreciate your approach as that sacred community builder and not as this policy wonk. I think your imposter syndrome has really served you in being able to create a really humanistic framework that is a living framework. It's not a policy report that 10 people read and kind of has a shelf life there, but it's something that we're really trying to activate different folks in thinking about what does this policy agenda look like. So we're really curious to hear more from those on this call in terms of how you see your role in policymaking or practice change around some of these agendas. Next, I would like to introduce Fred Ridley, who I had the pleasure of meeting in May. Fred, I know you were recently in conversation with the godfather of social connection, who we all worship, Bob Putnam. So we're definitely curious to hear a bit more from that conversation, as well as the Radically Rural event that you were at as well. Last time we hosted this conversation with Sam, it was interesting to think about the application of some of these issues to rural life and civic life in rural areas. So really excited to get your take there. Fred is the executive director of Weave, the social fabric project at the Aspen Institute. He previously served as the chief advancement officer for the YMCA of Greater Cincinnati, where he developed a fundraising board, positioned the Y as a dedicated community partner, and led advocacy efforts, program impact, and volunteer management. Before joining the YMCA of Greater Cincinnati, he served as the National Director of Urban Development for YMCA of the USA, the Y's National Resource Office. There, he served as the principal thought leader and strategist for programs and services impacting over 3 million teens around the country. He is passionate about the development of communities and its people. He's spent 2 decades ensuring the positive life trajectory for youth with a focus on urban, underserved communities, and poverty. So, Fred, want to invite you into this conversation, hear a little bit more about your work with Weave and also, what this framework surfaced for you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alexa. So that is my boring bio, but on the fun side of it, my most coveted titles are favorite uncle, brother, son, nephew, godfather, and I'd like to think I'm a good friend as well. Over the last couple of weeks, I feel like I've been on the road nonstop. I just spent less than 24 hours in Denver talking to AARP experience core members about the role they have in solving societal issues through their service. I did the same thing at the Radically Rural, and I can never say that right, Radically Rural Conference in Keene, New Hampshire, and spent a good amount of time with Bob Putnam talking about the role of the everyday person in solving society's issues. And Bob talked a lot about this moral. He says, aside from stats, we need to talk about the morality of our country and how we should begin to shift the roles of how we solve societal issues to young people since they will inhabit the earth. So we had an amazing green room car ride and dinner conversation about our role and kind of transferring over to the youth today. And he's like, you got to listen to more kids. And I was like, okay, calm down. But it was a really good conversation. And I feel like I got to know him in much greater ways. You know, when I think about our work at Weave, I think about trust, social trust. Right now in our country, trust is at an all-time low. People have decided they don't trust our institutions. Sam, they don't trust those government officials that we want them to work with. They've decided to revolt. But I think a more sobering stat is that most people are now deciding that they don't trust their neighbors. 74% of Americans surveyed said if you have an opportunity as my neighbor, you'll take advantage of me. And so what we are working on at Weave is, you know, we hear that narrative, we see those stats, but everywhere I travel to around the country, I hear the stories or I see people in neighborhoods working together to solve issues. We call them Weavers. When I think about the work of Weavers, I think about in 1933 in March when FDR took office, everybody had taken all their money out of the banks. The banks were dry. We were entering into the Great Depression. FDR went into Congress and he worked on all these supports to support banking. And then the next day he got on a fireside chat and said, Americans, trust me. Trust me, your money is safer in banks than it is under your mattresses. And the next day, the equivalent of about $20 billion showed up in US banks. Now, we don't trust our leaders like that anymore, where they told us to go put our monies from under our mattresses in banks, but they trusted FDR at that time. And so, but what I believe is that most people now are trusting these neighborhood FDRs. And there are people in their neighborhoods around the country who are hosting conversation projects over a meal. There are people who are deciding that our neighbors don't talk, so we're going to string lights up in the neighborhood so that people can have conversations. There are people who have decided I was run out of my rural town because I identify as a member of the LGBTQ community. And I don't want that to be the case for any other young person. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to make people I'm going to get accepted back, and I'm going to make sure that this space is the same for all young people who live here. And so our work at Weave is how do we find those people, support them, connect them together, but then work together with them alongside of them to help them continue to rebuild through tools and resources these communities that everybody through stats believe are no longer getting along anymore. We believe when trust is high in our country, and this is through stats. They started asking this question in the 1950s through a survey. Who do you trust? And they found that trust, social trust, gives us the highest amount of leeway into understanding the human experience of people in our country. They understand that when trust is low in our country, crime is high. People revolt against our democracy. When trust is low in our country, people decide that banks fail. And we see this every day on social media with people fighting in public and all this discourse that we have. But when trust is high in our country, people decide to get along. They work together. They believe that I need you, you need me, we all need each other to survive. And so our work at Weave is, how do we find more of those people? How do we support them? How do we fund their work? How do we offer tools and resources? How do we connect them together so that they can share resources amongst each other? And then how we can inspire a new generation of people to figure out their role in weaving together their community. We're so sold out for this that earlier this year we launched what we call is trustmap.org or trust.weavers.org. I can never remember. We go back and forth between those two, but it's a neighborhood score of a 2 to 5 mile walking score in every zip code in this country based on trusting behaviors, whether people vote, whether they volunteer outside of their home, whether they show up for their neighbors. The Census Bureau collects stats on these things. And then the trusting infrastructure, where there's third spaces, whether or not there are barber shops and community centers and coffee shops where people can organically come together. And then we track social media data to see where people are actually liking and going to public events. So trusting intentions. And we wrapped all of that up, coupled with some amazing stories about how people are building trust in their communities, big and small, all in a way to make sure that people are seeing their role in building trust. You know, our work connects so much with this framework that Sam has put together because we believe that the people living as close and living through the issues that are facing their communities are the best prescribers of the prescription to solve the issue that they see outside of their door every day. But often these people go unrecognized. They work quietly. And we believe that in terms of policy, that policymakers should be knocking down the doors and walking through their communities to recognize how these people can be embedded in the process to help solve these issues. And so this framework that Sam has put together not only gives our policymakers, but it also gives active participation guidance to the people who are living and breathing these issues every day. And so our role is to help to make sure that tools like this that Sam has put together can actually be embedded in the work that we're doing. So I think I covered all the notes I was supposed to.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. That was terrific. Really love both of your perspectives on this. I want to open the conversation up to the group. We're really excited to hear from those in the room, your experience, how you see your work intersecting with some of this agenda. There's some questions in the chat. And so while folks are thinking of potential discussion questions, feel free to post those questions in the chat, or you can come off mute and ask them. But just wanted to see if the two of you had questions for each other. I think one of the questions that I'm really wrestling with following our practitioner gathering is, what does that journey look like from doing deeply place-based work to developing more of a vocation around policy making? It's not just like policymakers being awake to people on the ground, but I think there were so many practitioners at the event we hosted in May at our Benjamin Franklin ceremony who were these social entrepreneurs or had been doing incredible community-based work for 20 years. And we're saying, okay, I want to get out of just the program piece. I want to shape these broader coalitions in my community around social connections and social capital and what that actually looks like. And so what advice would you have for folks like this who are really leaning into their ability to make broader policy change or influence institutions in their own backyards?
Fred, I'd be curious to hear your bird's eye view from working with the Weaver network of kind of how you've seen that come together. I pointed out a few groups, but I'd be interested what you've seen too.
I'll give you just a couple examples. In a previous career, I worked for the YMCA of the USA, and I worked in 4 or 5 local communities. But every year I would gather YMCA volunteers and I would gather YMCA staff, and we'd go to our state capital, and then we all fly to DC. But we would march with a big set of questions, but also demands of our policy leaders. And we talk about things like youth development, safety around making sure the FBI background check was an equitable experience across the country for every community. We talk about things that really matter to not just the rooftops, but the people who are working on the ground with things. And we give everyday kind of applicable stories of how this affects us adversely or positively in a way that the lawmakers could understand. I mean, I would be so bold as if I went to a meeting and they only sent out an intern. Not that interns are bad people, but I wanted to talk to somebody who could actually listen and do something. And so I would push and say, listen, I'm here with 12 people. We want to talk to the representative, bring them out. They would get annoyed. Sometimes they wouldn't bring the person out. But we really, really pushed hard so that they understood what it was like to do this work on the ground. And then a couple of years into my time here at Weave, we launched a project called Weaver Awards in Baltimore, where we gave cash award to folks who are really doing amazing work in their communities. People who are that hanging the light story was a Weaver awardee in our first cohort. He said our neighbors can't talk during the pandemic because we live on a street where there's no lights and nobody will listen to me. Will you give me $5,000 so I can hang lights on my street? And we did, and you can drive past this street now and there are people sitting outside having conversations, right? We gave funding to somebody who just thought his people in the community didn't talk more enough. So he started pulling his barbecue grill around with baked beans, macaroni and cheese, and ribs and grape soda. And you can go to any barbecue in Baltimore, and Shorty is hosting it. And it looks like a We Are the World convention because there are people from all over the place. But they're sitting down having these conversations through a script that he puts on every table. So we've seen people do amazing things, but we've also seen them get excited that an organization like the Aspen Institute or Weave or David Brooks is highlighting them, and they take that, couple it up, and they go run for office so that they can really take what they're doing on the ground in their community now to the policy changing side of it. And so we feel like our work in highlighting them, but also inspiring them and making them feel like leaders. One of the things I also believe that we do really good at Weave, some things I don't, everybody doesn't do everything really good. But one of the things I feel like we do is we share the space with these folks as leaders. So all these other events that I've been on the road for like almost 9 weeks straight. I'm a little tired, right? But every city we go to where applicable, I take a group of weavers with me and I put them on the stage alongside of me because I think the leaders, our funders, our policymakers should hear from them as leaders because they should be the folks directing the change in communities.
Yeah. No, there's so much there's so much there. I mean, Alexa, I want to make sure I want to get to the question both from my experience and kind of doing this research, but is it the pathway, like the pathways from kind of doing community building to like actually advocating for policy? Is that kind of what you're trying to get at?
Yeah, I think so. I think what we realized is that there was kind of this hunger, this appetite to do policymaking and
Yeah.
advocacy from people that are normally in community building or placemaking situation. And so what are the supports for them? What are the tools? What is the level of like how does that identity shift happen? You have that kernel of desire to step into a kind of new advocacy role. But
Yeah.
how can those people be supported on that journey?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question, right? Because like it's the thing. Um, if you were to discuss this around like social connection or social capital, I think maybe you guys are thinking about this. It's like kind of a weird thing to organize around because it is embedded within everything. And so I think there's like multiple layers to that question. One is and I think this is kind of speaking a little bit to what you're talking about with like weavers, or my friend Pete Davis calls them cultivators, like people who are on the ground in a place like day in, day out, just doing the work of making that place better. And it's like inherently place-based work. I think there is something like with on the ground of like that very experience of doing it unearths all of these things where you end up seeing policy gaps. And I think then those people end up just making those changes themselves or through organizing capacity. So, for example, my friend Teju Revolution, who is the founder of Gather4, which does kind of neighborly organizing in the housing projects in Brownsville and Brooklyn. They just started coming together, right? And they just, started coming together around like issues in their neighborhood. And week on week, the consistent issue is that NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority, had not made repairs in one of the housing projects for 30 years. And so what did they do, right? They came together and they said they had like this idea of like, our complaints aren't working. So what if we celebrate? What if we celebrate these people? And what they planned a celebration gathering like 4 months in advance. They say, we're so excited. We're going to host a celebration in 4 months to celebrate all the repairs that you made. We've called the local news. They're going to come and they're going to come highlight what you've done. And guess what happened? Like the NYCHA made the repairs for the first time in 30 years. And there was, of course, the stick of, hey, we're going to get the news here to spotlight what you're not doing. But there's also the kind of carrot of these are people who oftentimes are from very proximate communities to the housing projects who are dealing with people and oftentimes just experiencing people's complaints. And here's an opportunity to be celebrated. And so it was actually that work of being really committed to a very specific thing in a very specific place that then unlocked a kind of policy or political change that they wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. And so I think, my dream of this is kind of like continuing to take what Weave does and I think what RSA is trying to do in some of these groups that are focusing on place-based people who are building or weaving or cultivating community, allowing them to not just connect within place, but connect across place and build that kind of sense of solidarity and cohesion. Because then you realize, oh, you're advocating for housing and social capital in Brownsville. I'm advocating for housing and social capital in Cincinnati. What can we learn together? Where can the shared work be? And that seems like a real opportunity. I'll say there's an element here, and I'll pause, but there's an interesting question around the role of philanthropy in all of this, because, the story of, shared this a little bit on the last call, but I think, no offense to Bob Putnam, but the more compelling Harvard researcher on the change of civic life, in my opinion, is Theda Skocpol. And like Theda Skocpol wrote this book called Diminished Democracy, which is about how we shifted from membership to management in American civic life. And when we shifted from membership to management in American civic life, we went from federated membership networks that, the YMCA is one of the few that still exists, although the YMCA has its own set of challenges. We went from federated membership networks to the kind of corporatized top-down nonprofit model where we have a board and funding over here and we have membership over here. And what does that do? But it creates scarcity cycles for nonprofits. It forces us to measure everything because the funders don't trust us. It puts us in silos within place, and it also disconnects us across place. And so to me, a role in which we're building this kind of movement type capacity that's both around civic change and policy change also necessitates kind of shifting power back to the community builders who are involved. And shifting power often is not the software problems that I think Putnam talks about. It's the hardware problems of where governance and revenue are situated. And so that is the thing that I think philanthropy can play a role, but hopefully the end state is shifting towards more sustainability and more alignment. And I think that's this thing that's maybe under discussed in some of these conversations. I'll pause now because that was a lot of words.
No, Sam, Alexa, if I could just jump in. Sam, I thought that was amazing, and I agree with you 100%. I was having that conversation about the YMCA yesterday. I see somebody on from the Granite City YMCA. So I'm not talking bad about the YMCA, but I do think we have, there's a time in our country in which YMCAs were all run by volunteers. There's probably one professional staff member, but the bulk of the work happened by volunteers. And so people had a sense of pride in the place they lived in. And now there's 250,000 professional full-time staffers, another 500,000 part-time staff at YMCAs around the country. It's a $7 billion industry. And so I think the YMCA is the place I learned to walk in my cut my first teeth in like leadership, but I do think a system like that doesn't make way for the person to show up and say, how can I solve these issues I see outside? But Sam, one more practical thing, a question that I'd like to jump in is, as I think about this, I think the weavers, the folks who are kind of like fed up, who step up and say, Aisha Butler, who lives in Chicago, decided that she wanted to live in a place that was beautiful. And she was looking out her window and saw two young kids throwing rocks at each other in a vacant lot. So she corralled all her neighbors. They bought all these vacant lots, what forced the city through some policy change to sell it to them for pennies on the dollar. Then she started an organization called RAGE, the Resident Association of Greater Inglewood. And how can the residents there begin to solve issues together? And so I'm wondering, like, what constitute, like, I know in my mind what constitutes policy change, like what a policy change is, but I think what she did in Chicago is a policy change because they made them sell her, the lot for pennies on the dollar. But all of the folks that we're working with are people who are like fed up with something and decide to solve it. How would you push them in a direction of policy? Like, instead of being this one-man band of like trying to fix food insecurity in their 4-block radius, how do you push them to think about the systemic side of it from not just triage, right? Like, how can they go
Yeah.
bigger?
Well, yeah, and I think this is particularly when you're talking about people who are in more marginal situations where you're kind of always in triage mode.
Yeah,
And I think, I don't think there's a easy answer, because if
yeah,
there was an
yeah,
easy answer, I think we would have figured it
yeah,
out.
totally.
But I do think we can pull from the past to kind of inform the future. And there were a lot of people in a lot of marginal situations in the civil rights era who were able to kind of collectively come to realize
Yeah,
their power, and not just do kind of triage based strategies. And so I think, like, learning, like, what did we learn from that? Like, I think a big thing that we learned is actually the process of meeting and just gathering and giving people leadership roles like really matters. Like, I think the narrative of the civil rights movement is very much around rights, right? It's like we got the Voting Rights Act, we got, these different like rights oriented acts. But like, you could also look at the civil rights movement, and I think you should also look at the civil rights movement as a very incredible success of communitarianism. It was a success of lots of different people meeting for decades about how to kind of enact change. And I think the double-edged sword of our current technological environment, layered on top of the decline of the federated membership network, is that it's really easy to get instantaneous action, but it's really, really hard to do the durable, difficult work of building community. And so that requires meetings, that requires organizing, that requires all of that stuff. And so I think in that regard, I think what I think about is, like, if this person, like Teju, I'll bring up because I know that example, like Teju in Brownsville is having conversations with other people across New York City. And it's like, how do we even recognize kind of our shared problems or shared needs? And like, how do we build, and we're talking about this from more of an organizing perspective, but it doesn't need to just be from an organizing perspective. How do we build power, or kind of connection to be kind of larger than the sum of our parts? And I think it's hard to not just think to not go back to this funding piece, right? Because like the funding landscape oftentimes puts people in competition with one another. And so how do we not see ourselves as competitors, but actually having shared projects?
Brilliant. Thanks both. I want to just bring in Francis's question. Francis, feel free to come off mute and ask this question, or I can read it, whichever you prefer.
Oh, I can jump in quickly. Thank you both, Sam and Fred. What a great session. Sam, kind of going right to that point you were making about movement building and power. And I was just interested in hearing more because I know Weave does such a brilliant job with storytelling of how do you move in that relational organizing space of sharing stories to build trust, and then also bringing in the institutions to build that trust as well, so that solidarity starts to happen. That's a big question.
Well, first, aren't you getting like a PhD in narrative storytelling?
something like that. Yeah.
So what, sorry, can I turn that question back on you since I'm not getting a PhD in narrative storytelling? I mean, what's your hunch? Like, and I'd be curious because I'm probably less positioned to answer that question as you two are.
Oh, no, I doubt that. I'd love to hear more from Fred. I always go to,
Oh, Francis, you've
people.
heard from me for years. You don't, you don't hear anything else from me.
You do it. You do it so brilliantly, Fred. You've already brought in so many stories
Yeah.
today about actual people doing this work on the
Yeah.
ground. And I think that so often we hear it just takes so much time
Oh,
to
yeah.
do that, to get to know
Agree.
people, but it's
Yeah.
so essential, in my
I
opinion.
think, Francis, I think, and I think you already know this, that the storytelling component is the thing that makes it seem easy. And it also makes it seem way more human. And so, I know the organizing work you've done in Chicago over the years. In my mind, it's such tough work. Like, how can I do that? And all the other things that I have going on, right? But when you tell the story of the work you've done in Chicago and how you organize neighborhoods and how you've done all these things, it makes it seem more consumable and easy and also way more relatable, right? I think you are like the biggest person in the whole wide world, right? And so I'm going like, but I'm just as big as Francis, so I can do this as well. And so I think these stories that make it seem human, it makes it seem more consumable and relatable. And you also get inspired by the stories of what you've heard other people tackle in their neighborhood or their city or their town or across the country. I mean, I hear stories every single day. Yesterday, I was in Denver talking to a bunch of volunteers working for AARP's tax prep program. So they do free taxes for senior citizens. And the average age of everybody in the room was like 75 years old, who had all had storied careers, retired, and wanted something to do. Came off the stage, sitting at the end of the stage. There's a young lady who's meeting me. She had to be about 80 plus years old. And she goes, I've been coming to these for years. You inspired me to keep on going. I wanted to quit and retire again. I go, how do you retire from a volunteer job? And so she goes, there's so much more work that I can do. And I told the story about a member at the YMCA, and she goes, I feel like this work is keeping me alive. And so I value the storytelling component in so many ways because it like awakens a real dormant part of our society when they hear, read, or see these stories. But you got to make sure they're consumable too. So real quick so that people can get the meat and then walk away.
Yeah. I, so there's two things come to mind. The first is this kind of you in your question you asked about like institutional trust or institutional distrust, and I think I may have even said this on the last call. But I think the question needs to be turned around is like why don't the institutions trust people? Not why don't people trust institutions? And I think like the shift towards kind of a managed technocratic top-down approach to governance and decision making like people aren't stupid. They see they can experience when they feel this lack of agency and that like they're being used kind of transactionally as kind of pawns in a game. And so oftentimes like in frankly like elite left-leaning media it's like oh this like why don't people trust institutions and it's like what have institutions done to earn that trust and why don't those institutions trust people and so like I just think like that reframe is quite important that's just my one piece on storytelling like I'm a big fan of kind of Marshall McLuhan's like view of like the medium is the message and I think, frankly, and this has been a big topic of discussion among my peer group, the current approach to civic storytelling is stuck in the 1990s and 1980s. And like we need to recognize that the mediums of communication have like fundamentally changed. And so like as someone who just wrote a report, like another white paper report from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences is not going to do anything to change our civic kind of storytelling, our civic culture. A PSA is not going to do anything to change our civic culture. Like the current means of communication for people under the age of 50, maybe even older, is like the fifth estate. It's memes, it's influencers, it's all of these different domains. And if you're not orienting your storytelling to those domains, you're actually not even you're not even competing with other actors that are competing for pessimism or competing for nihilism and these other things. And I think like there's just a complete mismatch here where we have like dorky people. Sorry, I'm being a little, this is my hotter take, but like dorky people writing research reports, myself included. And then like actually where the action is, which is on, and you're seeing this from both campaigns going on these type of podcasts, but like these mediums where people are actually having their views shaped in really important ways. And so like a really important thing would be actually to get into those mediums. Like, why don't we have people talking about a more to like young men, a more communitarian view of what it means to be a man, going on Theo Von's podcast and going on those places, right? Like that's actually the avenues that I believe we need to go down. And I don't think another PSA about being a good dad or another PSA about these like is going to do anything to shape the culture of American life. Sorry, that's my hot take. It'll go on the internet, and I'm sure people will get angry at me. But
Sam, I agree with you, but I think the one pushback I would have to that is, my godson was with me for the whole summer. He just left for Fiji on a 2-year assignment with the Peace Corps. And I think he helped to hang the moon. That's how amazing I think he is. But he is so ill-informed of the world and history and so many things. And he will only give me the bite-sized 2 90-second view off TikTok on something that he's learned. I remember he was telling me why he wasn't going to get a vaccination was because of what happened in Tuskegee. And so I said, well, tell me what happened there. Like, give me the story. And he had the story completely wrong. And so I just wonder what's the happy medium of, these quick bite-sized views to get people like really to dig in. But how do we get the rest of the narrative to them, the rest of the story, the historical context? And I tend to, if I hear something, it'll spark me to dive in. But I'm closer to 50 than I am to, any other age.
yeah,
And so I'm the side who will read a report that you and Francis will write, right? But what about this up and coming group of young people who won't read the report and they'll just take your 3 minute spew on masculinity as the truth?
yeah. Well, I think the answer is uh, not the answer, but the question is we need to come up with an entry point.
Yeah.
And without an entry point, can't get into the deeper conversation. And I worry that we're not even putting our like as someone, I think people with shared work, um, potentially not even putting ourselves in position to have that entry point.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the concern. But there was a question in the chat, which is how does like the big tech, how does like kind of big tech ecosystem influence all of this? And this is deeply related. I mean, we are the my my like I went to Stanford Business School, which was a very bizarre experience. And my experience of Stanford Business School in economics of big tech and media class was that the fundamental thing that these tech companies are competing for is our leisure time. The more of our leisure time we are spending on a streaming service, on a social media app, on whatever it may be, is money for them. And so it's actually impossible to have this conversation around like community building in real life when we're not like without having a simultaneous conversation on like the mismatch in resourcing and investment that is going into the largest companies of all time versus the meager resources that you and I both know that so many of our community groups have, including the YMCA, a $7 billion organization. Like that is a day's budget for a lot of these tech companies. And so that is very, very important dynamic in all this. I'll pause. I know Maureen's got a question.
Yeah, Maureen, please come in.
Yeah. You all are stringing together so many things that I have thought about. And I think the question I have boiled it down to is, in your work, why do you think we stopped convening, communing in the first place? Or like some threads, right? To understand like how did we get here, to understand how do we get out of it. Some notes I wrote down though that you guys are hitting on, right? I think there's like monetization of our time is in the room, right? Like Sam, you were just talking about it, but also from people trying to get together. Everybody's like, I don't have time. I don't have time. And it's real in some communities, right? People are working 3 and 4 jobs just to get their basic needs met. That doesn't leave a lot of time for just getting together, right? So, yeah, without getting on a like soapbox of my own or some of the ideas that I think around this, I would be curious to hear from you both. What do you think led us, or the factors that have led us to stop convening and communing in the first place?
I go ahead, Sam. You go first.
I could go, but I'll talk for a long time.
I blame everything on the microwave, right? Like folks are like, "What a microwave?" When I was a kid, we were poor. We didn't have a microwave. We came home late from school. My mother had to warm the oven up. She had to put our food in foil, put water in the skillet. All this stuff had to happen for you to eat. An hour later, we were having dinner. Now you get home late, 30 seconds, ding, food is ready. It's time to eat. And so we want everything quick and fast in this country. We want relationships quick and fast. We want love quick and fast. We want everything to be quick and fast. That's just a down and dirt, like boom, like that's
Yeah.
not the reason, but so many things. You can blame this on so many things, right? I've read all of Robert Carroll's book on Lyndon Johnson. And if you read the first series down to the last, well, hopefully maybe not the last. Hope we'll get another book out of that series. But if you get down to the last one, Lyndon Johnson, it sounds like he was riding a horse to DC from Texas. And then you get to the last book, he's flying back and forth. And so all these like modern technologies have changed our country and have influenced us from being from this whole we as a community to now, it's amazing things that we can convene you all around the country on Zoom. But at one point in this country, we actually had to all drive or hitchhike in a room to sit together to have these conversations. And so I think in some regards, connecting together is way easier than it was before. But because of all these competing things, we've become less and less a society that decides that we should be together versus I should be together. So
I just
Yeah,
finished,
I agree with all. Oh, Maureen, jump in.
just responding to that, I just finished The Upswing by Robert Putnam that argues that we're on this I curve in so many different places, and he layers a bunch of data over it. And I think you're echoing that, and he made a really compelling argument in that book.
Yeah, I think I did a whole problem definition section for the framework, and it was really, really difficult because it's just like it is an interlocking and dynamic set of problems, right? It's not one thing. I put out another report a month and a half ago on like the class divide and social connection and a class divide in civic life, and I've had a lot of conversation with journalists who are like, what caused this? And to say one thing caused it is to like oversimplify this in a really meaningful way. But I guess there's an economic story, there's a technological story, and I think there's a kind of sociocultural story that all could be told. The technological story, I think, is kind of what I was talking about of like the competition for our leisure time. You can pinpoint, the introduction of television, which I linked to that in the chat. Like the introduction of television, you started seeing people's meeting attendance, all this stuff go down. Because the thing that you used to be able to get by going to the bowling league that Putnam talked about, or by going to the meeting, you can now get that kind of synthetic kind of connection and entertainment in your own house. But Wendell Berry has another really good essay on this called The Work of Local Culture, and he talks about this in rural areas. So I think like that is there. And then like where we are now is it's just that on steroids because it's like literally algorithmically designed to keep us on it as long as possible, and it's in our pockets. And then you layer on top the fact that we've like lost local news in a ton of areas, which disconnects us from place. And now we're just in like verticalized silos of just like nationalized connection rather than connection on the ground. There's an economic story here, which is, I think, multi-layered, but one is one of economic precarity, which is like people have, as unions have declined, as we've seen these kind of instantiations of unpredictable scheduling practices, people, particularly on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, have much less control over their schedules. And if you don't know what your schedule looks like next week, how are you going to plan to go to church? How are you going to plan to spend time with your family? How are you going to plan to be in community? We've seen a massive regional economic shocks with kind of the China shock in the 1990s that have led to like regional economic recessions that have not recovered in parts of the Rust Belt and in Appalachia, where like the core of civic life has just gone away, and you have civic opportunity deserts. And then like let's not forget like these sociocultural things, which is like introduction of therapy and the kind of the focus on the self as the kind of end rather than the focus on the other. The entering of women into the workforce. These women were providing all this free labor for these civic institutions. And like, guess what? Like they entered the workforce, all that free labor went away. And then men who started leaving the workforce as women entered, if you look at their time use, they were not, it's not like they're filling the slack there. They're like the men without college degrees who are not working oftentimes are just in front of a TV or on the internet, right? So then that's not being replaced either. And so all these things are happening at once. Not to mention that college has become this great sorter, we're talking about, where we've like really seen the college divide is now the dividing line in our kind of where we live, who we interact with, and our like relationships and social support. And so it's created a situation where everyone is doing worse, but then the people without degrees who no longer have the religious support structures, the communal support structures, the familial support structures, the union support structures, um, are doing much worse. And so I don't know, it strikes me like there was this element in the policy frame or in the research that Claire just shared, where a quarter of Americans without degrees said they have no close friends, and 35% of Black Americans without degrees said they have no close friends. And like you can chalk that, you can like just turn that into a piece of data that's unhuman, but like it is, I think, a moral stain on our country where we're leaving a third of our population of a specific group alone. Like, what is the like to Fred's point on what Putnam was saying around the spiritual and moral component of this? Like, what does life feel like? What is the substance of life when you don't have a friend, when you have no one to turn to? And so I think like that uh, as a call, like that should be a call for all of us, and not just something that other people have to deal with.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sam. Maureen, fantastic
I'll
question.
stop talking
Like,
for the rest of the
no,
time after that.
that's great. I feel like there's some questions that we scratch on these conversations that we could spend our whole lifetime exploring, but that feels like a juicy one. Garrick, want to hand over to you. Please come into the conversation.
Thank you, Alex.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. I'm sorry. I have a failing power plug that goes into like an interrupt request conniption fit, and then it takes over the system. So, anyways, if you can hear me now, then let me just get to this point. Coming back to the issue of policy and influence, I've been passing back and forth between a few different sectors in my journey. The clean tech sector predominantly, nonprofits in that area, which led me to lobbyist organizations and so on. And I'm just going to tell you, I'm extremely disappointed and extremely underwhelmed by the effect. I would say that they're getting their butts kicked with regard to making change, and these factors are connected to this. And with regard to the philanthropy discussion, I have come to be quite cynical, and I put it this way. The most important slide that's become a part of any one of these nonprofit and NGOs deck is the one that has their sponsor logos right on it. And that's the one that they spend the most time working on and the most time talking about and featuring in their discussions. And yet they have no shortage of time to go celebrate their activities at the brew pub while the utilities, for example, continue to get over on the population. There is a big gap and a big lack of urgency and a big sense of complacency. And I want to offer that up for your commentary, coming from a much more technical and operational space than I think you are bringing to this discussion here today. Thanks.
Thanks, Garrick. Fred or Sam, do you want to come in there? And I think we'll have time for one more question and parting thoughts after that. So feel free to put any final comments, everyone, in the chat. And then Sam and Fred would also just welcome you to have any closing thoughts.
Yeah, Garrick, that's a great point, and I always say it's such a tough line, especially I'll take on the nonprofit part because it's a necessary evil to raise funds to do really good work, which statistically about 87% of nonprofits who are completely honest and doing work in a good, equitable way to make sure that they're really working to solve issues, and there's always this push-pull between donors raising money and the real need. And I don't know if we'll ever get away from that. If you look at some of the earliest nonprofit givers. I was reading the what is it, the book, The Eyes Were Watching God, and the letters that she was sending back and forth to her funder was really like, and she says in her own notes, I had to lie to her to get $50 so I can buy clothes, shoes, and sanitary napkins. And so it's a fine line that people have to play when raising this money to do good work. And I don't know sometimes which line, I tend to try to make sure that I'm only doing what's right and talking more about the work than we do about our funders. But it's a necessary evil that I'm not sure we'll ever be able to get away from. So.
Great. Thanks, Fred. There's another question in terms of how this agenda looks translated into rural environments versus urban environments. From a policy change standpoint, is it the same? Is it differentiated?
I mean, I think it depends on the specific policy, right? So, Jen, I know you're in Missouri, like a kind of housing policy in St. Louis is going to look very different than housing policy in rural Missouri, right? So I think in that way it is different. I think the other, another big difference is kind of the demographics of those places. So like the demographic situation in many rural places is kind of demographic outflows, where in a lot of urban places it's inflows. And so in urban places it's oftentimes how do we, like, let's take the housing in neighborhoods, for example, right? Like people bring up this issue of gentrification. Like part of what gentrification is like actually not being able to kind of like move through change together, right? There's a displacement element of it, which is a kind of housing, like a housing policy question. But there is also a kind of cultural change element of it where it's like, oh, it's people who move in or are not respecting what they're moving into, and kind of distorting or erasing the culture of a place. That's going to be very different than in rural communities, which is like oftentimes, a sense of loss, because of kind of just the outflows and remembering what was. And so I think that is where it differs. I think the end goal of what the framework is focused on stays the same, which is how do we kind of regenerate or strengthen connection in this place? And with that end goal, like the strategies may differ, but we're kind of going towards some of the same point. I'll also just note that a lot of urban places, a lot of urban places and a lot of rural places actually face very similar challenges of disinvestment. And like there's really good examples of kind of recognizing the shared work, and potentially shared policy solutions from kind of what are oftentimes more minority, disinvested urban communities and what are more kind of white, older rural communities, both of which have felt the implications of extraction, and extraction and lack of agency.
Brilliant. Just want to bring in Kim's question, which I think is a great one. We touched upon this in our last conversation, but any insights you can share on the role of creativity to rewild our social connectedness? I think this is so important because for a policy conversation, this can feel like a dry mandate, but I think from a community builder perspective, what does it look like to create social connectedness? And I know last time we talked to Ash in terms of the work that she does with rural communities and just how, joy and weirdness and wildness was such a part of that work. So wondering, Sam, if you can share a bit about that, or Fred, in your work with Weavers, just people that have approached this from a really human embodied lens versus like a policy framework.
I'll go real quick first. I think like the future of kind of community building civic work is fun and weird and bizarre. And I really love Ash, who was on last time in the Department of Public Transformation. I love what Civic Lex is doing in Lexington, Kentucky. I love what Warm Cookies of the Revolution is doing in Denver, Colorado. Like these are groups that are like led by creative artists who are using arts both as an entry point for deepening relationships and then as an entry point for like connecting to deeper civic engagement. And in some ways, Fred in our back and forth about like the medium, how do we get someone from the TikTok to the deeper engagement? I think that that bridge is going to be fun. And I think so. I think like that is the key thing, and I think artists, comics, performing artists have a lot of those strategies in place. And then there's just like a lot of different stuff that the arts can do to bring a place to life in terms of the creative placemaking side of things. But I'll pause because I talked all in the last answer. Fred, I'm curious your thoughts.
No, no, I think that was perfect. I'd only add that I think creativity for me is arts and how folks can be creative and how they offer connection as well, or the solving of issues. So when I think about it, I was on a panel a couple of months ago with a doctor from Harvard University who thought that his place, his ER room, should be the place where people should get connected back to society, either learning the right to democracy, so voting. And so on his ID badge, you turn it around, there's a scan code, and he'll ask you a bunch of questions. Are you registered to vote? Do you have a place to live? Do you have this? Do you have that? And people can just scan all those three different codes and it'll send them off into a ward or go get support afterwards. So I think like, there's a place for everybody to be creative in how they're leading the change in their particular community. And it doesn't have to be the way that I do it. It could be, I find that all of our weavers come to this idea of weaving through some great triumph, some great tragedy, or some skill that they were born with. And so it's up to us to choose how we go into making sure our communities are a little more connected.
Mm. Yeah, and I think I just like this. This shouldn't feel like eating your spinach. Like this is
Yeah.
like it
Yeah.
is really hard and it is really messy, and I don't think that should be understated. But like it's like really joyful, playful
Yeah.
work that like you you don't. I mean, we all know this because we're on this call, but I think like appealing to the fun and the joyful, in addition to the kind of obligation and the importance of it, is that first part is really important too, and sometimes we miss it.
I love it.
Spinach is good. Yeah, I like
Yeah,
spinach.
endorsing spinach. Um, Thank you so much. I mean, I think that point is just so much around how we get out of this zombification of our culture. And so have learned so much from all of you. Thanks for the questions on the line. I think for me, I'm really struck by the storytelling thread that came out of this conversation. Francis, I had no idea you were getting a PhD in storytelling, but I think for us, we've been wrestling with what is the role of storytelling in terms of supporting this movement for social connection, because it's so many facets of this agenda in terms of, as you mentioned, the trust building piece, but also just making this agenda accessible. Like everyone has a different starting point to talk about the pains and opportunities associated with social connection, if it's mental health, if it's from an economic standpoint. And so I think the storytelling work really allows people a way in addition to thinking about the mediums and how we get sort of this agenda in the hearts and minds of young people. So that's something I'm really left with. The other component that I think, Fred, you really emphasized and came up was around the funding piece. And I think what we noticed in our gathering in May was suddenly an economist puts a spotlight on social capital and funders are willing to listen. And yet people have been doing this work for at least like the last 20 years, or if not like our whole human existence. And so why do we need an economist to tell us that social connection is important? But rather than feel resentful around towards economists, I think we can also invite them into the movement. And I think what excited so many of the practitioners that we met was that now they actually have an opportunity to attract resource to what they've been trying to do. And they have a logic that they can appeal to overcome some of that funder bias. So those are some of the things spinning in my head. I think, Maureen, your bigger question about why we're here, I think we all feel so atomized in today's society, and there's so many different reasons for that. So we'll definitely be leaning into that more. Because it affects our daily, well-being and the systems we engage with. But want to just thank Sam so much for your framework. Fred, thank you so much for your wisdom and perspective today. There have been so many different resources and links shared, so don't feel like you have to grab and cut and paste all of them. We're going to be sending an email out following this with all those resources and a kind of recap of today's conversation. Want to give a few shout outs. We're curating a Social Connections newsletter. So if there's ever any agenda items or resources that you'd like to share with the RSA team on Social Connections, please do so. We're trying to create more visibility to the different ways in which people are approaching this topic and all the different touch points that are coming out. I know you can also follow kind of Sam's Connective Tissue thread on LinkedIn, which is really just wonderful snippets from all the amazing conversations, Sam, that you've done that has come into this. And Fred, is there a good Weave shout out?
Yeah, so maybe two shout outs if that's okay. Number one, Sam, thank you so much for the framework. I think it fits so right into our weave, how we support weavers around the country. So I'd love to figure out a deeper connecting point with you and the work that you're doing. But the second one is, the issues we see in society with the lack of connections were all created by us people, humans, and so it's up to us to solve them. And so if you go to weavers.org/join, you can join our newsletter or sign up for our online community or our learning center, or go to trust.weavers.org and learn more about our trust map and hear some of the stories that I feel particularly inspired by of what people are doing in their communities and figure out how you can dig your heels in where you live because it's the most important place.
Brilliant. And with that, we'll sign off. Thank you so much for joining us today and looking forward to the next conversation. Take care,
Sure.
everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thanks so much
Bye,
for
all.
joining us.